Uh, Hopefully by the time I finish, you'll realise that although the subject's a wee bit niche, it can tell an awful lot about it can, various pieces of archaeology, and it can feed in a lot of different ways. You almost actually had my unicorn mask and snaffles as demonstration models here tonight, but apparently EasyJet don't allow it. Which probably, is a mercy, because try explaining that one if you were being searched at coming through Gatwick. No, officer, really, I always carry a snaffle and a unicorn mask about. So anyway, we're on with the show here. So why would you want to examine equestrian equipment of the past? Now, there's one thing, by the way, I'm going to put it out there. I don't use the term horse gear. Actually, that's a really good way to make me sort of get really itchy and touchy, because if anybody's been around the stables, you'd be wondering what a horse gear was. It's always either lorinary for the equipment that goes into a bridle, the small pieces, or else equestrian equipment or tack. So that's exactly the terminology that I'll be using in this. So why would you want to examine it in the first place? The technology, like every other form of metalwork, and also bone and antler and everything else, what you use on a horse reflects very much where that culture sees its own technology and the advances that it's making. It also tells us a wee bit about animal husbandry and training, and how well are they actually dealing with animals. Most importantly, especially with roads, it can tell us about travel infrastructure. And of course, where you get travel infrastructure, you're going to have trade and interconnections. It also tells us about a self-aggrandizement, display, showing off. Doesn't matter whether you're in a chariot or a cart or whether you're on horseback. It's one of those things which you make a statement as soon as you're actually on horseback. Also, as Junior there would tell you, horses are very cool, and I'm not going to complain about that. So, just look through this. So, the first thing we're going to do is acknowledge something about British bits. Now, the last work that was done on this was by the lovely Natalie Ann Polk, and it's been a long number of years since that was done. So, things have moved forward a wee bit since then. My PhD was in Irish equipment, which has always been a bit of a thorny subject, especially regarding a chronology. And I found very quickly that we couldn't actually look just at Irish equipment without actually looking at everywhere else. That includes Europe. Ireland, by the way, has a massive amount of European influence that comes in, but Northwestern more so than across Europe. Britain, of course, you have very, very unusual tack, and nobody has really made a great deal of sense out of them. But because of a wee grant that I was given by Society of Antiquaries of Scotland last year to examine basically everybody's bridles, it wasn't basically nailed down. We've actually managed to get some sort of answers on that. But with those answers, it's archaeology, there's always more questions. So we're going to look at the British bits tonight, and I'm going to use some really old-fashioned stable know-how. Now, some of you that have done pony clubbing, hung around stables, you're going to go, why didn't anybody do this before? I'm not going to presume anything, so I'm keeping it really at a level that it's really only an overview. And hopefully then, if you have any questions afterwards or anything more complex, just fire at me, and if I can answer, I will. So the first job really that came clear is to separate the functional tack from the non-functional. And to identify then, once we had those separate, to identify how the functional bits actually would work. And the big question is why? And then from that information, start to formulate some ideas about what's actually going on in the run-up to those pesky Romans coming over here and doing their Romany stuff. You'll see down there at the bottom of the picture, you'll see one of these very peculiar, which have been called triple joints and everything. I actually prefer to call them at this point Protowaterfords, and I will explain that why as we go along, because now we know how they fit, the ones that do fit. So there's lots of different kinds of bits out there. A bit can go in a horse's mouth, and it tells you where you want them to go. But they have to be trained to accept a bit. And some are nice, and some are not nice. Some are for, say for example, driving. If you're driving, you'll tend to use a slightly harsher bit because there's much more distance between you and the animal's mouth to actually direct where it's got to go. If there's lots of horses in a team, then they tend, normally you would see things called Liverpool bits. You'll see those actually in Germany, the equivalent thereof with Husby and places like that in the Iron Age. But every horse has a different mouth, and it responds differently to different kinds of bits. And some of them are remedial. Some of them are there to fix problems. Some of them are there for show and to look really flashy. The Irish are probably the worst for that. Some are really harsh, some are gentle. And whenever you get into the real complexities of the thing, you've also got some bits that don't even fit in a horse's mouth, that they're actually bitless. And you'll see there how you actually put a bit into a horse's mouth. You feed it in. Normally, in my day, you used to coat it with something tasty like apple puree, and it would take the bit in, and you would get it used to just walking about with it. But there's one thing here I want to draw your attention to really, really closely, and that is, do you see where the thumb is? You'll see that the cheek rings fold back to be flush with the sides of the horse's mouth, okay? I want you to hold that thought as we actually go into the analysis, because that's really important for understanding the British bits and why they don't do that. So we're in a really, really fortunate position because as archaeologists, we can compare ancient bits to modern bits. And these are some of the things which I'll discuss. The one at the bottom there that looks like a whole wee row of, it has 3 links. That's probably going to be a bit of a spoiler, what I'm going to talk about. That's a Waterford, a modern Waterford bit. The one up at the right-hand side is your typical, the top right is your very typical double-jointed snaffle with loose rings. The rings just go round and round and fold back. And the other one, if anybody's used to seeing Viking and Saxon stuff, they'll see what's called a full cheek snaffle because you've got these big bars that come down and they're there to stop the bit sliding out. It's actually one of the most popular. And the ancient world, no matter what it is we have in the modern day, it exists in the ancient world. That's an incredible gift for an archaeologist because you can always be playing, compare and contrast all the time. And we know exactly what to expect regarding usewear as well. And if something deviates off that, it's a big red flag going, oh, why is that happening? So, how we measure a mouthpiece, this is all the background stuff before we get to our in. I have seen archaeologists writing, and they measure the whole length of a bit. That tells me absolutely nothing whatsoever, except that's the size of a box I'm going to need to put it in post-excavation. Whenever I refer to a functional mouthpiece, I'm talking about this part here, right in the middle. And you'll see there on this photograph, you'll see the corner where the cheek ring is. Oops, sorry, this went back. Back we go. You'll see it has to sit out. That's that girl's showing how there has to be some room between this part and the actual folding back of the cheek ring. The part that's in the horse's mouth, I call the functional mouthpiece. And that actually is really important because it can actually indicate, very loosely, but still gives an indication of what size of an animal we're actually dealing with. And if I was to take you this evening down to some lovely tack shop in London, they would have a chart, very like this one, that shows you The size of bit. By the way, we're really old-fashioned horsey people. We still use inches. I have to actually think in centimetres for my archaeology head, but if I go into horsey head, I automatically am thinking in inches of mouth. Now, a miniature pony, I don't know if anybody's seen them. They're roughly about the size of a Labrador. It's a 3-inch size mouth, sometimes slightly larger. A little baby horse would be about maybe 3.5 to 4. Shetlands, they've got big heads. They're very sturdy wee animals. And actually, I've known in my day some Shetlands who have actually bigger mouths than some Arabs and breedy horses. But that's why we have to say it's ish. There's always a few exceptions along the way. But the size of your functional mouthpiece can actually indicate what size of an animal that you're dealing with. So just to show you what I mean, there's a very good photograph that'll show how a bit should fit. And that's just your ordinary snaffle. You've got the outside there where your cheek ring goes into. The cheek ring moves, it's sitting flat. You've got your reins, and you've got the mouthpiece in the mouth. So that's your pony clubbing 101 for today. We're going to move into the archaeology now. So because nobody nowadays, well, we hope not, uses swords or halberds or axes very much anyway, we have to actually go to reenactment, folks, and experimental archaeology to actually get an idea of how the use were actually works on those. And I know that there's some people, I think there's a chap up in Scotland, Matt Knight, I think, was doing a lot of work on sword use were by comparing as to what Barry Malloy, again, over in Ireland, has done a lot to do with parrying to see exactly what kind of damage, how we can compare if the swords that are found in depositions and the weapons that are found in depositions, have they been used or not? But the great thing is, for any archaeologist, bits have not changed in about 3,000 years. It's only the materials change. The inflection of what they wanted to do, that changes. But when you can identify an ancient style, you have a really good idea of how it was used, why it was used, and under what circumstances. In short, you can tell what the humans want to achieve with that animal. And good comparative use were. People forget that. I think that it's one of the things which I've certainly run into whenever I've been looking at an awful lot of the Northern British and Scottish equipment, is that people are mistaking use were, they're thinking it's going to be brutal. If you look at, I mean, what I was going to bring over today was a bit that's about 30 years old. It's still, and it's copper, which is the closest actually to the ancient snaffles that you're going to see. And there's hardly any use were on it. To destroy something, it would have to be absolutely ancient and had been used every day for about 100 years or more even. Or it would have to be just really lousy casting. The big pointers, if you want to actually look for where a horse is interacting and chewing with a bit, you want to look for wee tiny nips. You want to look for burnishing. You want to look for saliva stains if it's copper alloy. These are all the things that you want to actually look for. If it's a very soft copper, then yes, certainly start to look where there's been bends and regular friction of reins and pressure. But otherwise, don't be thinking that it's going to be snaps and breaks. Quite often that's just poor quality copper that has given up the ghost once it's went into the ground. So there has been that. But use were on the metal for a bit. It needs a certain strength, but it doesn't need brute strength. It still takes a very, very long time. So we're now going to move on to the bits of Iron Age Britain and see what they can tell us about both the horses and the humans. And you'll see there the Paulden Hill on the right-hand side. I have a special place in hell for those. I don't like them at all. I'll tell you why. The very sharp cuff would have actually cut into a horse's mouth very, very easily. Look how tiny, look how small your functional mouthpiece is. Also, this single joint is, if you pull on the reins, it's going to go straight up into the palate. It's going to inflict quite considerable pain. If it was slightly narrower, it wouldn't be so bad, but they're quite boxy, they're quite short, they're nasty wee things. Then you've got lovely things like Hagburn Hill over here, which is getting almost into the Irish type shape. There's a lot of similarities. But they are still doing things their own way. Look at this really, really long joint that exists in the middle, and these two little tiny shorties at either side. Do you remember whenever I showed you back there? I'll flick back to the Waterford. Yep, this one here. I want you to have a look at that and think of the Hagburn Hill. So, we know that Britain was hanging on to the idea of vehicles, driving vehicles, for a lot longer than either Europe or certainly Ireland. But Ireland's out on its own, doing its own thing. They sort of jump. They don't even pay any attention to vehicles worth talking about. We're only starting to find some hints, some tiny hints that they exist. But they were probably gifts being brought over. But here, you've of course got things like the Aras culture. And there's been lovely work done, of course, on turrets by Anna Lewis as well on that. And more recently, Greta Anton's book, which brought up the state of the art on a lot of the vehicles like Pembrokeshire and stuff that's been found within the past decade, really. But exactly like Ireland, there's styles and designs that are uniquely British and that you won't find anywhere else. And they're like these big, big cultural markers. People make things because that's how they want them to look. And the British stuff doesn't really look like anywhere else. It is actually totally unique. But they keep doing these very strange, very elongated central piece, and then these two tiny stubby things where the cheek rings don't fold back. And there's been all sorts of nonsense talked about those. And I hope tonight I'm going to show you that we're dealing with things that are usable. Some of them are, and some of them are not meant possibly for this world. And even doing this presentation, there was something struck me. So at the end, I'm actually going to throw something wild out to you to think about, because it's something that I'm playing with myself, which I hadn't actually realized until I came to do this presentation. So they are dreadful things. I love this. I abused the meme of the little questing white monkey going, what? Too many times, unfortunately. But we're actually going to deal here with the tale of three snaffles. And there have been three that possibly the biggest load of nonsense, I think, has been talked occasionally. But also there's been some really, really good work that is prepped for this. So the first one we're going to do is probably the most simple, which is the middle B, what I call the middle B2 bit, because it's very straightforward, and by the time I show you the smoking guns on it, you'll wonder how anybody ever thought this could be used. Okay, so the functional mouthpiece is 5 centimeters, about 2 1/4 inch. There is no horse on this planet, I can guarantee you, that fits. Now, whenever I did do a mock-up, it fits my Affenpinscher perfectly. I'm not going to say he liked it, but we certainly know that that's the size. But that's the size of a tiny terrier's inside of its mouth. Not a horse. It can't actually fit any living animal. Now, I want you to actually have a wee look here at the details on the sides of it. To me, it looks like it's a failed, fractured casting on. Nobody, I don't think, has done any XRF on these yet. I would love them to. I'd love to know if this is a lead-based solder, because it's really, really a bit... is it a repair to make it look a bit better? And it's a cold, or again, it could be a cold shot where the molten metal cooled too quickly and didn't actually get to cool down properly. And it's a really bad repair, even if this was the right size to fit any animal. It would never have been robust enough for actual functional use. Now, even if it's flux residue, you would have thought for showing off some sort of mascot or symbol, you would have thought you would have tidied, well, you would like to have thought somebody would have tidied this up a wee bit. And yet there is use wear upon the rings. You can see here. But not on this ring, only on that one bit of ring. And again, that could possibly be being squashed from within deposition. We don't know a great deal about the depositional background of this, so because it is a long time ago. The rings, technically, if this was bigger, this would have been what we would call a mullen mouth, a single piece of metal that goes in a horse's mouth. But you would need it probably about 7 or 8 centimetres for it to even fit the teensiest, weensiest wee pony. But 5 centimetres. I want you to look at the joint of your finger. That's the functional mouthpiece. So there's something very, very odd about this. And I was delighted to see its messiness because it sort of started to open up a lot of pet theories as to what might have been going on with British stuff. Tale 2, we'll look at the other bit here. Now, there's some things here that if I draw your attention to the use wear and how this looks, one of the things whenever I was up in the Dick Institute in Kilmarnock, they let me loose on a lovely wee snaffle that nobody had ever looked at, which was from a cranog up there. And it was in remarkably good condition, but nobody can get a firm date on it. I happen to think it's right on the edge of the Iron Age, but I'll show you where you can read a paper about that later. But it became quite clear that these odd elongated bits were actually functioning in some way like a Waterford, which is why I call them Protowaterfords, because they aren't all those little links along. The problem has been that the cheek rings, see these parts here? These don't fold back as they should, which means that the actual mouthpiece has to actually jam into these little cast notches to hold it almost at a 30-degree angle either side of the horse's mouth. So the cheek, these very beautiful decorative cheek rings, are sitting at an angle where you can't really miss them, but they're sitting out like this, with the reins then attached. If the reins are attached, that's anybody's guess. I'm starting to get the hang of what the bridle system of this period of the Iron Age is in Britain, and it's closer to what used to be called the bearing rein. It's lots and lots of rings actually holding heads together and holding them in position. But if you look again at this, it's got really strange use wear. It's not what I would expect to see in a stable. I mean, this has been like nipped down into nothing. You just won't see that on use wear. And these are good copper alloy. They're actually, it's good alloy. It's not copper that's just going to go bing. I'm going to presume that it's actually a leaded copper because of the fancy ornamentation. It gives it a wee bit extra slip. Again, don't hold me on that, but I would presume that because wherever you get all that lovely decorative stuff, you tend to use a wee bit of lead to get it into the nooks and crannies. But again, this is not something that I would expect to see. It's almost as if this has been stuck together. Or again, are these bits in fact older than what we think? That it has in fact clapped out? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that one. But this could actually be used. This is one of the functional ones because of the size, but it will sit almost like a Waterford. And the wee one that's up in Kilmarnock. Tail number 3. Well, as you can see, that has been cut quite cleanly. And then things basically jammed on together. Want people to have, you can see there, I'm holding it there at the 30-degree angle roughly. But again, these cheek pieces do not move. These cheek rings are solid, which means that they actually have to sit out either side. And this is why I will never forgive EasyJet, because I could have showed you much easier by actually super gluing, or not super gluing, but blue tacking a Waterford together and a snaffle together and handing it round to you to see exactly what I meant. But there's also something here which has totally confused me, which is you will never really get, do you see that very square shape of U-square? I don't know what could create that. And I have absolutely no idea, because in 40-odd, high 40s of hanging around stable yards of years, I've never seen anything that squared off in use. I have no idea. But again, these are all broken up. These, the cheek, it's almost as if you jam that part on, and you jam that on. But you'll see that there's very little actual brute force or use wear on the functional mouthpiece. And again, this one is really tiny. Remember, you can't have that part inside a horse's mouth. We're down to this again, and this is again about under 3 inches. Again, one of these not functional bits, because there's nothing, there's no horse alive that could actually use them. They're too small, even as you see them like that. And that's just back to that. So just to show you here how a Waterford fits, do you see the wee tiny stubby sides? Well, think about the wee stubby sides of those big long Protowaterfords. And then it bends round. And the whole idea is that it follows the contour of the mouth, which in fairness, an ordinary snaffle doesn't do. They're not the worst. I have actually had a couple of ponios in my day that responded very, very well, but they were usually quite lively fellas. But that gives you an idea of exactly how these things are fitting. They're being held at an angle rather than the cheek ring sitting right beside the horse's cheek. So a wee bit about what these would have, the functional ones. It's a flexible bit. It molds around the horse's mouth and creates an even pressure. You know, at the very beginning I had said about how I really don't like Paulden Hill because I think they're savage. That once that nutcracker of that thickness gets pulled, it goes right up into the palate of the horse and can do damage. These will not do that, obviously, because all your pressure is towards the outside. It can move in all directions, so horses who find it difficult to lean on take control of it. So it actually gives you pretty good levels of control. And especially strong-headed horses seem to like it as that sort of shape because it's loose. They don't feel, it's almost a con, that they feel that they're still being allowed away with it. But whenever you pull, it's not that bad. So what we can say about the horses that are the functional ones are that these are very lively animals. And because they're lively, it suggests that they are being handled with some kind of expertise. The animal husbandry, they want them to look spirited and they want them to look really, really lively. Because again, if you're in that kind of chariot or something, you want to impress people. Look at me and my horses, and only I can manage to control them because I'm the big man or big woman. As we know that with Aris, we know for a fact there are women, for example, being buried in chariot burials, etc. But again, we don't know the context very much of all those peculiar bits. So as I've said, the ones that are too small, I think, are the ones that I find interesting. So it's a very, very different bitting system from that in the continent or Ireland. And it is uniquely British. And that's the question, wondering why. Because, of course, Irish takes little bits of the continent, but they interpret it their own way. They seem to take certain little bits of Ireland, up in, especially the Scottish stuff, seem to take little bits of Ireland and their technology for handling horses, but they interpret it their own way. And of course, you've got wonderful bits like the ones from Swanton Morley that you could literally take out of a museum cabinet, give a quick clean up, and fit into a horse's mouth, and you wouldn't have any problem. It would be a straightforward Waterford, as you would understand. So there's obviously a desire to show off with all the beautiful metalwork. So what of those, but here's the thing, what about the ones that can't be used? Are they objects that are being deliberately reassembled from broken parts? Now, to me, that's what they look like to me. For either religious or ritual purposes. So no, I'm not going to go the ritual line just yet. We don't know very much about, it's been mostly those lovely wee chunky, sensible ones that have been within chariot burials. We haven't really seen any of the peculiarities in chariot burials yet. Were they maybe cobbled together to use for hexing people? Was it some sort of a magic process or whatever? Was it an initiation of some sort? Or are they objects with an ordained short lifespan because they're maybe older than what we think they are? And I think that's something, certainly with some of the functional ones, I don't think we can discount the fact that they might be older than the first centuries AD, that they could be considerably older. And by the time they come down to be dropped in whatever they're being dropped in, their family heirlooms, or they're something that meant something. Or were they just so useless and broken up that they give them to apprentices to try their hand here, especially whenever you think of that one, which is the cold cast. Is it something that they want people to try their hand at, which they can't really make that big a mess of? And I want you to remember how much effort it takes to actually wear a piece of tack down, regardless, even if it's a softer copper. It's going to take an awful lot to wear it into the state of which you're seeing some of those. So you're left either it's very old and it's had some sort of other life, or else it's been treated totally differently. And that's the case. We might be catching a glimpse not just of the living, but possibly of the dead as well, or the place maybe they thought the dead went to, like the upside down, a place of the broken. And this is where I have questions myself. If it's connected with burials or funeral ritual, and we've no idea with most of these pieces, are they reflecting the state of the dead? Now, that idea was slightly wacky because reading Greta Anton's book, which is lovely, and she was talking about the spearing of people in burials. And you see this on the continent, and there's been a couple in Britain as well, where whenever somebody's been unearthed, there's all these spears have either been driven into them or else thrown on top of them. So if these are all broken up and battered, are these a way of actually reflecting the state of the person that was using them? I don't know. Again, are they all old? Are they made into something symbolically new that's only meant for, like, not the land of the living and wherever it's meant to be? Again, we can't discount magic and superstition or anything like that. And I personally, being ever pragmatic, I don't feel that I can kick away the idea that it might be apprentice pieces where you give it to the youngest ones to have old broken things to see how they might get on and weed out who might have talent in putting things together. In Stannick, you had 1st century AD, they think it was a pot. And if you look at the stuff in the British Museum that was found in Stannick, now we know the date because it's brass, they're all very like the Middleby shapes, but they're all broken up. There's nothing that's complete. That's the one with the lovely wee horse's head mount that they think was in a wooden vessel of some sort that maybe was set fire to or whatever. So we know that there is that. There's pots of broken things. The King's Barrow in Arras, 300 BC, going back before those. There's, of course, a nice bit, which has a back-to-front cannon. It's twisted, so in fact it couldn't ever be used, even though it's the right size to be used. And then, of course, the picture I'm showing you here is an Irish one, which is real Frankenstein's monster that I love. It's from Killyvan, and it's actually made of 3 different types of bits, plus 2 different kinds of cheek rings. And we don't know what's going on with this, if we're perfectly honest. You've got an Irish Iron Age centre, you've got a British cannon, and then you've got an Irish Type A cannon, and then you've got early medieval cheek rings. So we've no idea what's going on with that whatsoever, but it seems to be that it's been cobbled together. Incidentally, the use wear on this is what I would expect, and I'll just point out there to you. I'm hoping that shows up at the very top. There's the kind of use where I would expect from bits that were being fairly regularly used. So here's the crazy idea that I'm going to fire out for the first tonight. We know that it suddenly struck me as I was doing this, and thinking about Stonic, and thinking about these bits that have been jammed together. The Neolithic period, going way, way back before this or whatever, there's burial mounds, collective burial mounds, where you've got Auntie Agnes's arm and Uncle Geordie's ankle bone, and people are made up out of this selected pieces of people, maybe whatever they were representing, whatever they were good at. It's almost this case of the broken is something that's waiting to be made whole again. And of course, in Japanese culture, you've got kintsugi, which is where if something is broken, it carries its own beauty, and you repair it that you can see the damage, because that's part of its story as well. Now, we know that that idea exists in lots of cultures, except nobody does it quite as beautifully as the Japanese. But could there be some kind of permutation of that existing, in that just on the cusp of Roman occupation? And the question which I think I would be asking, and probably will at some future stage, is this something that we haven't looked at in other metal objects? Could this possibly be a case of the damage is part of the whole story that makes up its own story, especially if it's very old and it's coming to the end of its life, and maybe nobody around anymore that appreciates, or everybody's intermarried out and the bloodlines are gone? Is it time to just let it go? And it's one of those questions, I don't know. I think it would be fascinating to look at an awful lot of the other metalwork of the British Iron Age to see if there's any parallels there whatsoever. So, this has been kept deliberately not technical. There is a journal called Turin, which is by Trivand in Budapest, and I have a wee paper in it called A Little Bit of Early Medieval Scotland, about the wee Scottish bit, and you'll see a picture of it there, and the use were that sort of give it all away. The mouthpiece is sweet iron, the cheek rings are iron, and the cuff is copper alloy, so it was lovely to be able to see the use were exactly on it, and to be able to understand exactly what was going on. And it was actually, in many ways, the smoking gun as to how those really peculiar Iron Age British bits actually are fitting this almost round the mouth. Not that way, not even that way with the cheek rings back, but it's a curvature, and the design actually sits out and shows. And that's even the ones that work and the ones that don't work. But there is a certain amount of difference in both of them. As you've seen, there's things that just would not be possible. So it has been a detective story. It's not over yet, unfortunately, or fortunately. A lot of the stuff found in Scotland we're finding feeds into early medieval Ireland as well, which has been a project I've been working on with the Royal Irish Academy there in Dublin. But you can download, we're waiting on it going online any day. It's Turin, Volume 2, 2022, and it's the International Journal of Equine and Equestrian History. They don't mind how technical I get, so forgive me if it does get a wee bit technical. It was, as one would say, horses for courses. So all that needs to be said at this point is, as we talked about wild stallions, I have to bring up some other wild stallions of the deep and murky past. Be excellent to each other. Thank you very much for having me here. And questions are here.